In 1950, the Korean War was on the brink of ending. Forces from the United Nations, led primarily by the United States and including troops from allied nations, were advancing rapidly, pushing North Korean forces to the edge of collapse. Victory seemed inevitable, and the world watched as the US and its allies prepared to unify the Korean Peninsula under a pro-Western government. Then, out of nowhere, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops crossed the Yalu River, turning the tide of the war. Cities changed hands, battles raged on, and the conflict that seemed almost over dragged on for years. One decision altered the course of history forever. But what if China had never entered the Korean War? What if the United Nations forces had won swiftly, reshaping Asia and the global balance of power? Today, we explore a world that never was, a world that could have been radically different. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment, do you think the Korean Peninsula would be unified today if China had stayed out of the war? Now, let's step back to one of the most dangerous and unpredictable conflicts of the Cold War. The Korean War was not just a regional conflict, it was a global showdown between powerful ideologies, military alliances, and emerging superpowers fighting for influence. The war began in June 1950 when North Korean forces launched a massive invasion into South Korea, aiming to unify the peninsula under a communist government. Within weeks, South Korean defenses collapsed, and it seemed that the entire peninsula would fall. However, an international coalition led by the United States quickly intervened, pushing North Korean troops back and reclaiming lost territory in a dramatic counteroffensive that stunned the world. By late 1950, these international forces had advanced deep into North Korea, nearing the Yalu River. Many believed the war was almost over and that Korea would soon be unified under a Western-aligned government. But history took an unexpected turn when China made a decision that would change the conflict and possibly the future of global politics forever. By the autumn of 1950, the momentum of the Korean War had shifted dramatically. After the successful landing at Incheon, United States and United Nations forces launched a powerful counteroffensive that forced North Korean troops into a chaotic retreat. What once looked like a certain communist victory suddenly transformed into a desperate fight for survival. Cities after city fell back into the hands of international forces. Seoul, which had changed control multiple times, was recaptured. Supply lines for North Korean troops collapsed, and their defensive positions weakened rapidly. Military commanders within the United Nations coalition began to believe that total victory was not only possible, but inevitable. As troops pushed further north, they crossed the 38th parallel, the original dividing line between South and North Korea. This decision marked a turning point in the conflict. Instead of simply defending South Korea, United Nations forces were now attempting to eliminate the North Korean regime entirely and unify the peninsula under a single government. By October 1950, international forces had captured Pyongyang, the capital of North Korea. North Korean leadership scrambled to reorganize their military while retreating towards the mountainous regions near the Chinese border. Many historians believe this moment represented the closest point North Korea came to complete collapse during the entire war. However, this rapid advance created a new and dangerous problem. United Nations troops were now approaching the Yalu River, the natural border separating North Korea from China. To military leaders in Washington, this was the final step towards ending the war. But to Chinese leadership, it represented a direct threat to their national security. The world stood at a fragile crossroads. Victory for the United Nations seemed only weeks away. Yet behind the mountains across the Yalu River, Chinese leaders were watching carefully, weighing a decision that would transform the war and global history forever. As United Nations forces approached the Yalu River, alarms spread within China's leadership. The presence of American-led troops so close to their border was seen as a direct security threat. Chinese chairman Mao Zedong feared that if North Korea collapsed, hostile forces could eventually target China itself. At the time, China had only recently emerged from its own civil war. The country was still rebuilding its military and economy. Despite these challenges, Chinese leaders believed allowing Western-aligned forces to occupy all of Korea would create long-term strategic dangers that China could not afford to ignore. In October 1950, China made a secret but decisive move. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, known as the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, quietly crossed into North Korea under the cover of darkness. Their arrival was carefully coordinated, avoiding detection by United Nations reconnaissance and intelligence operations. When Chinese forces launched their first major offensives, United Nations troops were caught completely off guard. Massive surprise attacks overwhelmed forward positions, forcing coalition soldiers to retreat under extreme winter conditions. What had seemed like a near-certain victory quickly transformed into a desperate struggle for survival. The sudden Chinese intervention pushed United Nations forces southward, recapturing territory that had been lost by North Korea. Pyongyang fell again, and the war shifted into a brutal stalemate marked by intense battles, freezing temperatures, and enormous casualties on all sides. China's decision to enter the war dramatically extended the conflict for nearly 3 more years. More importantly, it reshaped the balance of power in the Cold War, proving that China was willing to challenge Western military influence and defend its strategic interests, no matter the cost. But what if China had never entered the Korean War? Without Chinese intervention, the balance of power on the battlefield would likely have remained heavily in favor of United Nations forces. North Korean troops were already weakened, disorganized, and rapidly losing territory by late 1950. With no massive reinforcements arriving from across the Yalu River, United Nations forces could have continued their northern advance with far less resistance. Military historians often suggest that Pyongyang's government might have collapsed completely within weeks, forcing North Korean leadership into exile or surrender. A total military victory would have opened a door to unifying the Korean Peninsula under the South Korean government, supported by the United States and its allies. This unification could have fundamentally transformed the political landscape of East Asia, removing one of the most heavily fortified and isolated regimes in modern history. A unified Korea under Western influence might have developed economically much earlier than it did in reality. The South's rapid industrial growth during the late 20th century could have extended across the entire peninsula, potentially creating a powerful economic and technological hub decades ahead of schedule. However, such a victory would not have come without serious challenges. Integrating 2 regions with drastically different political systems, economies, and social structures could have created instability. The process of rebuilding the North after years of war would likely have required massive international investment and long-term military presence. Even with these difficulties, the absence of Chinese intervention might have prevented decades of division, military tension, and nuclear escalation on the Korean Peninsula. The question remains whether this alternate victory would have stabilized the region or introduced entirely new global conflicts. If China had remained out of the Korean War, the global balance of power during the Cold War could have shifted dramatically. A decisive United Nations victory in Korea would have strengthened the United States' position across East Asia, reinforcing the perception that Western alliances were militarily unstoppable during the early years of the Cold War. Such an outcome could have weakened the Soviet Union's influence in the region. North Korea served as an important ideological and strategic ally for Moscow. Losing the peninsula entirely might have reduced Soviet confidence in expanding communist influence elsewhere, potentially altering the course of conflicts in Southeast Asia and beyond. China itself would have faced significant political consequences. Mao Zedong's leadership gained international recognition and domestic legitimacy partly because of China's resistance against Western forces during the Korean War. Without this intervention, Mao's authority within the Chinese Communist Party might have faced internal challenges, potentially affecting China's military development and foreign policy ambitions. At the same time, the absence of Chinese involvement might have delayed or altered China's emergence as a global military power. The Korean War provided valuable combat experience and strengthened China's strategic identity as a defender of communist interests in Asia. Without it, China's role in global politics during the second half of the 20th century might have been far less assertive. However, this alternate outcome also carried serious risks. A complete Western victory in Korea might have encouraged more aggressive containment strategies against communist nations, potentially escalating tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union, increasing the possibility of a larger and more dangerous global conflict. If the Korean Peninsula had been unified under a single government in the early 1950s, the region's economic and social development could have followed a dramatically different path. South Korea's rapid industrial and technological growth during the late 20th century might have extended across the entire peninsula, potentially creating one of the most powerful economies in Asia decades earlier than reality allowed. The absence of a divided Korea could also have prevented the emergence of one of the world's most isolated and heavily militarized states. Without a separate North Korean regime, the global concerns surrounding nuclear weapons development, missile testing, and ongoing military tensions in the region might never have existed in their current form. This could have reduced one of the most persistent security challenges in modern international relations. At the same time, a unified Korea would have faced enormous internal challenges. Rebuilding infrastructure in the northern regions, integrating political systems, and managing ideological differences could have created long-term instability. The United States and its allies would likely have maintained a strong military and political presence in the region to stabilize the newly unified nation during its early years. Ultimately, China's decision to enter the Korean War shaped not only the fate of Korea, but the structure of global power for decades. If China had stayed out, the Cold War landscape, Asian geopolitics, and modern security concerns might look completely different today. History often turns on single decisions, and the Korean War remains one of the clearest examples of how one moment can reshape the future of entire nations. The Korean War remains one of the most pivotal conflicts of the 20th century, not only because of its destruction, but because of how close it came to ending differently. China's decision to intervene transformed what seemed like an inevitable victory into a prolonged and devastating stalemate. That single choice reshaped global alliances, military strategies, and political tensions that continue to influence the modern world. Imagining a world where China never entered the war forces us to question how fragile history truly is. A unified Korea might have changed the balance of power in Asia, altered the Cold War's trajectory, and possibly prevented decades of nuclear tension and regional instability. At the same time, it could have introduced new conflicts and unexpected global consequences that we may never fully understand. If you enjoyed exploring this alternate history scenario, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more deep historical and what-if analyses. Also, comment below and share your thoughts. Do you think the Korean Peninsula would be unified today if China had stayed out of the war?